Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you here on behalf of British Czech and Slovak Association to this panel discussion about Czech presidential debate that is to take place this weekend, both in the Czech Republic, but also in many of the Czech or all of the Czech embassies and Czech general consulates abroad in the whole world. We felt it was quite fitting to hold this debate, in fact, in London, where so many of the Czech expats live and are able to vote. In fact, there's over 1,300 Czech citizens registered to vote at the Czech embassy. Unfortunately, of course, not all of our fellow Czech expatriates are able to vote because of the distance to the polling stations. And of course, the question of the postal vote is always a question that appears when the Czech elections take place. Now, unfortunately, we don't know if this is going to ever happen, but as Czechs say, naděje umírá poslední. Now, it is my pleasure to be organizing this event together with the UCL, with the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and to have this amazing panel of experts here with us today. The panel will be chaired today with Dr. Sean Hanley, who is the Associate Professor of Comparative Central and East European Politics. He writes on democracy and parties in Czech Republic, comparative politics in Central and Eastern Europe, political representation of older people, and rise of anti-establishment parties. And so without further ado, I shall hand over to Sean, who will be chairing the session. And I welcome all of you who are here, but also many of you who are watching us live at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Jana. And thanks also to my colleagues at the UCL Centre for the Study of Central Europe, UCLC Centre for the Study of Central Europe, who've helped co-organise this. As you'll be aware, Czech voters are going to the polls this Friday and Saturday in the first round of the presidential elections. I'm fairly sure that almost everybody here knows a lot about Czech politics. But for the few that may not, either here or in our Zoom audience, and welcome to you on Zoom, Czech presidency is not hugely powerful, but has some important powers. It's directly elected. There are normally 2 rounds of voting, and if, as we anticipate, no one gets more than 50% of the vote, there'll be a second runoff vote between the 2 leading candidates 2 weeks after the first round. There are currently 8 candidates still in the contest, but there are only really 3 who matter, who I think we'll be talking about most. There's the former Prime Minister, billionaire businessman Andrej Babiš, who probably needs no introduction even to people who don't specialize in Czech politics, who has, as you may be aware, just been acquitted in the long-running Stork's Nest corruption case. 2 other candidates, leading candidates, are retired General Petr Pavel, who is a former head of the Czech army and who held a high-ranking post in the NATO military committee in Brussels. He's been controversial because of his early membership of the Communist Party under the one-party regime. And finally, there is Danuše Nerudová, who is an economist, rector of Mendel University in Brno, roughly a kind of vice-chancellor, who, were she to be elected, would be the first female head of state in the independent Czech Republic, the youngest head of state, and I have to add, as I have family connections there, the first head of state from Moravia rather than Bohemia. So in this roundtable session, we're going to talk about the Czech presidential campaign, the candidates, role of presidency, where the Czech Republic is going, what the campaign tells us about Czech politics, and what the different presidential candidates might be like if they were elected. And I'm delighted that we've got 3 eminent, well-qualified academic specialists on Czech politics, Czech society, who've not only published academically, but also been active in sort of broader kind of policy and public debates. So if I can introduce them from my right, your left, we have Barbara Havelková, Dr. Barbara Havelková, who is Associate Professor, Faculty of Law and Tutorial Fellow at St Hilda's College, Oxford. Her research and teaching cover gender legal studies, feminist jurisprudence, equality, anti-discrimination law, and she is author of the book Gender Equality in Law, Uncovering the Legacies of Czech State Socialism. In the middle of our speakers, Professor Jiří Příban, Professor of Law at Cardiff University, who's published extensively on social theory, sociology of law, legal philosophy, constitutional and European comparative law, and human rights. And his monograph, Sovereignty in a Post-Sovereign Society, was awarded the SLSA Socio-Legal Theory and History Book Prize. And then finally, on my extreme right, your extreme left, Professor, not politically, I should add, in any sense, Professor Tim Horton, who's Professor of Comparative and European Politics at the University of Birmingham, a political scientist with an interest in electoral and party politics, electoral campaigns, Central and East European politics, especially Slovakia, Slovenia, and of course the Czech Republic, co-author of the New Party Challenge book, which came out just not last year, 2021, and who a long time the joint editor of the Journal of Common Market Studies Annual Review of the European Union. So welcome to our three panelists. The format for tonight's event will be that I'll ask our three panelists to talk very briefly about what has really struck them about the presidential campaign as it's unfolded, particularly from the angle of their own particular research interests and specialisms. Then I'll follow up some of the issues that emerged, and I have a few, well, actually a very long list of issues that I'd like to take up with them. We'll discuss those, and then finally we'll open up to your questions and comments in the audience, both here and on Zoom. And to those of you on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A, and we'll pick them up at the end. So I think we agreed that Jiří, that you would kick off with some general remarks about the position of the presidency more broadly and the candidates. So if I can hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean, and thank you very much, Jana. Thank all of you for coming this evening, and it's absolutely great privilege for me to be here, to be invited from the provinces, from Cardiff, and because this is the most special place for a legal theorist from Czech Republic, most special place in London. Of course, because of Masaryk link, but also of Jeremy Bentham, who is, for us lawyers, basically one of the founding fathers of legal positivism. So thank you very much for this opportunity. My 5 minutes, very briefly. I will start with constitutional framework, then I will move to political parties and some criticisms, then to persons, and then a little bit of history. Constitutional framework. As we know, Czech president was originally elected by parliament, by both chambers, but since 2013, we have a general vote, which is highly controversial among politicians, but highly popular among the public. Citizens love it. Politicians hate it. Why? We have to remember that 2008 election was marked by horrible corruption and lobbying from different sides, and the whole electoral process was basically compromised by political elites in 2008, and that's why the constitutional change came. Is this change bad? Many people think so. The most prominent critic of the direct vote is Petr Pavel. I want to challenge this a little bit. One criticism is that look at what Miloš Zeman has been doing in the last 10 years. If we didn't have the direct election, this wouldn't happen. Really? Would Miloš Zeman behave differently if he was elected by parliament? I doubt it. I think it's a problem of the cult of personality. Second, if you say that some critics say that because you increase legitimacy, the temptation to increase power or grab power will be always higher for any president. Really? I doubt it, because from other countries in Europe, countries which are parliamentary democracies with strong parliamentarian tradition, presidents are elected directly, yet they don't cause a chaos in the presidential system. Look at Austria, look at Finland, for instance. So the problem is not a constitutional framework. The text and the legitimacy and legality of presidential position. I think the problem is much more related to history and to the traditional images of presidency in Czechoslovak and later Czech history. It's the imaginary of presidency is going back to, of course, Masaryk, but also to this traditional perception of Czechoslovak or Czech presidency as the authority which is not just political, which is not just about the statehood, which is almost quasi-monarchical entitlement. We always like to have somebody who is not just a politician. And this is a problem of Czech politics, because I would have expected that political parties in the last decade would generate experienced politicians from within who are able to transform from party politics or parliamentary politics into presidential head of state role. None of this has happened. So we have the problem of persons, and here I'm moving to persons now. So with political parties, they are far too weak, and there is a long historical undercurrent in Czech politics of distrust in politics as such. In Czech, we say politika je svinstvo, and distrust. We basically establish politics on distrust in politicians, rather than we don't presume trust in politics and politicians. That said, so political parties didn't generate any politicians, and Andrej Babiš is not a politician, he's an entrepreneur. And so this criticism applies to ANO, which is not a political party, which is a one-man show movement in Czech politics. It is also anti-politics. Now about persons, if you look at those 8 candidates, I'm sure Bara will talk more about it. 10 years ago, I was heavily campaigning for a woman candidate to stand against Zeman in the first election. And we failed. At the time, I believed that Eliška Wagnerová would be the right candidate who could bring a very different type of politics and political style into Czech politics, and could be strong enough to beat Zeman in the direct vote. 5 years ago, I made it clear, even in some interviews, my hope, my bet would have been on other candidates. And before the campaign started, I believed that in this election, a woman should stand and a woman should win. I had 2 hot candidates, Věra Jourová or Lenka Bradáčová. the fact that we ended up with only one female candidate in 8 is a shameful situation, which is, but unfortunately, a realistic picture of Czech politics, completely male-dominated. But the candidacy of the only female candidate is, again, entirely anti-politics. Inexperience in politics, it's Drahoš remix. And this is a big problem. Other candidates, there is some of them have some experience with institutions, international or national, but none of them are real politicians in the sense of Webrian politics as vocation. Andrej Babiš is not a politician by vocation. I will close here. For me, and I'm sure Bara will have more to say about this failure of gender balance, failure of political experience. Interestingly enough, history comes back haunting us. It's fascinating for me to see again, remarks about the communist past being the top card when some candidates said that they wouldn't appoint a former communist to the Constitutional Court. My immediate response would be, okay, so you have to cancel Rychetský, you have to cancel Klokočka, you have to cancel Hollander, and it's just some of many more. Yeah, it's almost like, as one friend said beautifully, can you imagine 1938, the crisis in Czechoslovakia, and the main presidential campaign topic would be, we have to odrakouštit, yeah, we have to de-Habsburg Czechoslovak politics. Let's get over it. There are challenges which are much bigger than dealing with the past, and I think this presidency should be about the future of Czech Republic. Enough.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. I managed to introduce the event without mentioning Miloš Zeman, the current Czech president who's finishing his second and final term. So maybe we can bring Miloš. Barbara,
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I will make 4 points, which are all around questions of gender. Having kind of assumed that I have been partly invited to break down a potential mantle brewing up, but it also is my specialism. So first of all, we can be asking the question, why the rise of Nerudova? We haven't had such a strong female candidate in the past. First, I think she genuinely is a good candidate, and she took the campaign very seriously, and I suspect Tim will speak more about that, and had sort of good timing, good momentum, good presentation. Second, the voters have been wanting more women in Czech politics for a very long time, at least 15 years, and the political parties don't supply them, which is partly why this is now playing out in the presidency. A recent poll said that 14% of Czech voters would be highly motivated to vote for her because she's a woman, and another 32.7% said they would be quite motivated. So that's about a plus 33%, where just the direct fact that she's a woman plays a role. On the other side, there's a minus 14 if you want. So there are also those who say they are being demotivated to vote for her because of her womanhood. But that's quite a significant difference in those two positions. I also wonder, this is a bit more speculative, whether there's a sort of a generational change in the electorate that doesn't, if you want, code politicians, and especially the position of the president in and indirectly masculine terms. If you look at older polls, you would have heard things like strong, decisive, charismatic, things that might have been not associated with female candidates. I think indeed in the past they haven't been. And I think that might matter less. As a matter of fact, again, the polls are showing that the rise of Nerudova was very much due to younger and female electorate, for whom for whom this kind of different kind of thinking about a leader, actually perhaps a shift in the understanding of what a leader should look like, might have affected that. And fourth, I think there is the Čaputová effect. Whether Nerudova is like Čaputová, I leave for later discussion. I think we'll all have some opinions about that. I personally think she's not. Not for better or worse, I think for worse, quite indubitably. But nonetheless, I think Czech voters can suddenly actually imagine a woman in that top position in a way that I don't think they did in the past. Second point is direct elections and gender, following a little bit on Jiří. I don't think she would have risen through the system of political parties, or anybody like her would have risen through the system of political parties. So the direct election, I think, can be gender friendly in that sense. Having said that, in 2018 we had no women candidates. We had a completely male selection. So it doesn't seem to, in a sense, go that way. It doesn't seem to guarantee that there will be women candidates, but it seems to at least allow for them to be generated or come forward without some of the hurdles that we know exist in the Czech political party system for the rise of women to the top. Then I want to mention as a third point an interesting question, which actually the last two questions have arisen in conversations on social media, some of which are both Jiří and I have been involved in the past couple of days. And one is what I call the husband question, which is that Neruda is obviously an entrepreneur. He's a co-owner of the, I think, largest Czech law firm, Pavel Holásek, which, as many law firms do, does also some unsavory things. And the question is, how much does this matter? And is this a conflict of interest? How should we look at it? Substantively, I'm not too troubled by this, I have to say. I think if eyes are kept on potential conflicts of interest more generally and in concrete issues, this can be managed. But there is a gender aspect, obviously, to asking this question. There's much higher likelihood that a female candidate is going to be part of a power couple, that the man is also going to be, high-powered career man, much more so than we would the other way around. And so it is a bit of a gender question. I just caution that I think we have to be very careful in how to evaluate it, because if we are going to be sort of very insistent on how we treat the female candidate because of the husband, we are again going to be very much disadvantaging women candidates. And the last point is, and this came out of discussions with Jiří on social media, is it feminist to vote for her because she's a woman? And I mean, many in the room, I think in Britain, this discussion has been had for decades, but in the Czech Republic, it really hasn't. And I think it's actually quite interesting to see it arise. I will say two things. One is that I think feminists want both to see more feminists in positions of power and decision-making, but also more women, whether or not they're, of our political persuasion. And so I think there's a real benefit to having a woman in that kind of position, even if she's not our ideal or favorite preferred candidate. And so and this is both what I think, but what I've seen also sort of women in my circles be saying, I think it's time. It's really time. We've had a lot of men. We can try a woman because she's a woman. You can think of it as a second point, as affirmative action, that the pendulum has just, especially in Czech politics, has just swung so far in one direction, that saying, this is actually my reason, and it is a legitimate reason to swing the pendulum a bit more to just actually having, even in terms of visuals, right, of power and decision making, to have women there present. I think that's a legitimate thing to want. And I'll finish there.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks. So, well, we kind of segue to Tim. I mean, Danuše Nerudová, talking about her very effective campaign. So we'll move to Tim, who'll talk about the nuts and bolts of the campaign.
Okay, so děkuji moc krát za pozvání. Thank you very much for the invitation. To Sean, UCL, and the British Czech and Slovak Association, děkujem, and thanks for organising this event, and to everyone who joins us here in person, appropriately enough, in the Masaryk room or online. I just wanted to say one thing before I get going. Being here for a Czech-focused event makes me think about the sad news about Robert Pinsent, who sadly passed away over Christmas. So in Pinsent-esque style, I hope that we'll have a fun, provocative and intellectually stimulating discussion today. So as Sean mentioned, one area that I'm particularly interested in, I'm beginning to work a bit more on, is about campaigning. I should emphasize I'm more of a comparativist these days. Actually, I follow Slovak politics more closely than Czech politics, but I hope still I will be able to offer something. Let me just say a couple of things about campaigning and what we tend to look at, because I suspect this audience may not be that familiar with it. So we tend to distinguish between mobilization, i.e. those voters with a strong attachment to a particular party or candidate, and the purpose of mobilization is just to get those voters to actually turn out, as opposed to persuasion or conversion, which is about convincing voters to switch candidates. Secondly, when we look at campaigning, we tend to discuss the different modes of campaigning. So this is billboards, TV debates, leaflets, social media, etc. And thirdly, we look really about the way in which the campaign is framed. And of course, the ultimate purpose of campaigning is to convey a message to affect voting behavior. I should just say, Sean said we should talk about what surprised you. I'm not actually that surprised by much of this campaign, but I will still hopefully say one or two useful things for this debate. So I will focus on the three candidates, not because I want to dismiss the others, but because I think it makes a lot of sense. So in terms of Babiš, I mean, Babiš is the Marmite figure of Czech politics. You either love him or you hate him. In that sense, I think he's quite similar to Janša in Slovenia or Fico in Slovakia. By now, almost all Czechs have a view of Babiš. Even yesterday's verdict of the Prague Municipal Court in the fraud subsidy case linked to the Stork's Nest scandal probably has no real effect on his popularity. What it might have is a little bit of an impact in terms of mobilization. It's worth emphasizing that Babiš is really following a classic mobilization strategy. His clear message is the Czech Republic is suffering, and the fault of that suffering lies with the Fiala government. He pushes the point all the time that his opponents, particularly Pavel, Nerudova and Fischer, are all backed by the parties in the governing coalition. And he seeks to stress how he is motivated by the interests of ordinary people who are suffering from the measures brought in by the Fiala government. In many respects, Babiš is employing a similar strategy to previous elections. He's active on social media, notably on Facebook. He's avoided the public debates. It's noticeable that a lot of scholarship about elections in Central and Eastern Europe often emphasize how important the debates are. So at one level, it may be a bit surprising that someone is refusing to take part. It was really striking, his absence from the Czech TV's Super Debata on Sunday, in which there was just a podium with a glass of water. Although he is expected to attend Wednesday's debate on Nova, so that's worth looking at. Why is this? Well, his decision is probably linked to the fact that he's a pretty poor performer in debates, and also the desire to be seen as not just another candidate. He's above the fray, above all of these other particular people running for this office. I do think that there are risks, though. I was really struck by his non-appearance, reminded me of the barbs thrown at Theresa May in the UK in 2017, when people were saying, if you want the job, you should turn up for the audition. But crucially, in some senses, it doesn't matter, because Babiš's support is very solid. He looks pretty certain to win something in the realm of the high 20s, maybe up to 30% of the vote, which should be enough to get into the second round. We may want to talk about predictions later on. His preferred method of campaigning actually is the talk show. And again, this may be not that surprising. It's reminiscent of his emergence in politics. He kind of emerged, in particular, linked into that talk show with Jan Kraus back in 2011. It's also, by the way, I would say from a comparative perspective, for me, rather reminiscent of the campaign run by Fico's Smer in the 2016 Slovak election, where Fico used very similar kind of techniques. These talk shows are then, and particularly key images and videos from those talk shows are then broadcast using social media. So, you know, often there's a sort of rather silly and not helpful debate about whether it's social media or whether it's traditional forms of campaigning. Actually, campaigning doesn't tend to be divided into two different modes. It's often about the way in which different campaigns will work together. What about Nerudova and Pavel? I think it's important to stress that both of them have the kind of elements of the newness appeal. Neither of them are party candidates. In fact, it's really striking in this presidential election that only two candidates are party candidates. That links in with something that Jiří was talking about in terms of parties that I'm sure we can come back to in Q&A. It's also worth emphasizing from the perspective of campaigning that, of course, both Pavel and Nerudova's campaigns are focused on persuasion because these are new candidates. They don't have, or they didn't start from a partisan base in the same way that Babiš did. There's also an interesting sense in which both Pavel and Nerudova encapsulate the distinction of many elections between the don't risk it, we need a safe pair of hands, which is Pavel's kind of appeal, and the things can be different or better, which is the Nerudova appeal. That's really how they're trying to frame the election. So a couple of brief things on the two other candidates, on Pavel and Nerudova. So Petr Pavel, or General Pavel, as he likes to be labeled, his pitch to the electorate is there's a lot to worry about in today's world, but here is the calm, relaxed, experienced man to deal with. Potrzebujemy zkušeného a klidného lídra, který nešíří chaos. You know, we need an experienced and calm leader who will not spread this kind of chaos. You know, his background as a military man in the Czech army and NATO, I think, have important resonance at a time when there's war in Europe. We shouldn't forget that. And his base and his background also in the campaign provides some nice play on words. Phrases like "Potřebujeme generální úklid," which I thought was a nice little play on the general idea. There isn't, though, much by way of details about what Pavel would do if he became president. As Sean actually mentioned in a discussion that we had earlier this week, many of the candidates in this campaign are rather content-free. Now, given the limited powers of the Czech presidency, perhaps that's not such a stinging criticism, but it's striking that there isn't much more than a "trust me, I'm a safe, reliable pair of hands" to Pavel's appeal. There isn't much more to that. Both Pavel and Nerudova have been quite active campaigning, getting out and meeting the people across the country. What's very striking is that Pavel is clearly trying to broaden his appeal in the past few weeks, increasingly appearing in civvies, in relaxed kind of shirts out in the countryside, and also making a pitch for the younger voters, encapsulated by a recent visit to a student pub in Davická and the kind of slogan Gen Z for Gen P. I'm not sure how successful that's going to be, but that was an attempt to kind of pitch for that. And I think both Pavel and Nerudova are aware that Babiš is about 80% certain of making it to the second round. So in a sense, their goal is to make sure that they are the other candidate. And actually what we've seen in recent days is a few more barbs being thrown from one to the other. Pavel saying he'd take Nerudova to the castle because he would need an accountant, which was rather kind of...
He didn't say that. He didn't say that.
He's quoted as saying that. Okay. Okay, thank you for the qualification. Let's just say that message has been spread.
That's true.
So it will may have, but thank you for the clarification on that. In campaigns, sometimes false things are said and false rumors spread. Well, we know that because we live in the UK. On Nerudova's campaign, if Pavel's campaign is pitched on his military experience at the time of war in Europe, Nerudova's is definitely linked to her expertise as an economist and the rector of Mendel University in Moravia. Now, Barbara spoke about gender. Maybe I would just say I want to underline that gender is a really important part of her appeal. And let's come back to Čaputová in Q&A. Crucially, Nerudova's pitch is kind of encapsulated in this notion of a kind of restarting the country. Her pitch is about newness, non-partiness, and kind of an anti-Babiš appeal, and particularly directed at younger voters. It's very striking. She's the most active on Instagram, which tells you quite a lot about the demographic that she's pushing for. Nonetheless, her campaign has lost a lot of momentum in the last couple of weeks. She's very much on the defensive these days because of the questions, which I'm sure we'll come back to, about her time at Mendel University and her expertise, how good an economist she really is. I might be overplaying it, but the decision of Josef Středula to drop out of the race on Sunday, may have given her a bit of a fillip. It was about the only interesting thing in the 2 hours of the debate, I would say. And it's also interesting that today she's really come out swinging on Facebook, attacking Babiš's claims linked in with the Stuxnet scandal. So I think all three candidates have tried to frame the election in a particular way that's been effective at bringing to them a quarter to a third of the vote. But there's no real sense that any of the main candidates has been effective at totally kind of framing the debate. And we're in for an interesting couple of days to see who of the three candidates will get into the second round. So hopefully that was useful. Sure.
Great, thanks, Tim. That's fantastic. Okay, well, thanks for that. I mean, it's interesting how you're converging on similar themes. I've just got a few follow-ups, which some or all of you might want to comment on. First thing that I noticed in all of your presentations is the question of parties and really what Czechs expect from their head of state. And I'm getting slightly different signals from different speakers. On the one hand, there seems to be possibly a problem that parties don't generate potential heads of state. And it's clear, I think, from the way the direct election law was framed, that the framers expected that it would mainly be party politicians, and they left in this option for, I think, so-called civic candidates where you have to collect 50,000 signatures, but in fact we've got 2 or 3 leading candidates are civic candidates who managed to get the 50,000. But on the other hand, there is this tradition of mentioned the Masaryk, shadow of Masaryk, and Pavel, of the non-party head of state, someone who will stand above parties. We know that Czechs has always had issues with political parties. And then finally, I noticed that actually you mentioned the issue, well, we haven't had, party politicians stepping up and becoming president. And I thought, well, hang on, we've had exactly that. We've had Zeman, who emerged from the Social Democratic Party, and we've had Václav Klaus. So I just wondered if you could come back and tell me how you see the party question, and also maybe are Czechs expecting a different kind of president? Are they actually evolving away from the stereotype of Masaryk? Of course, many Czechs are going to vote for Andrej Babiš, who's about as far from the Masarykian image as you could get. So maybe is there another kind of view of what the Czech head of state could be that we haven't really paid attention to? So I'd like to come back on some of those points.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. Maybe one clarification about the campaign of Danuše Nerudová, which I think, because Danuše Nerudová knows that now it's now or never. She has to be more assertive, more confrontational with Petr Pavel. So those of you who didn't follow it, she said, pan Pavel by si mě na hrad vzal jako účetní. Ponižování od mužů jsou u nás ženy bohužel zvykle. Mr. Pavel would want me at the castle, would take me to the castle as an accountant. This is these demeaning attitude is typical of men. Actually, what he which would be absolutely correct if he said that, but he didn't say that. He said, the question from Hospodářské noviny for the Czech audience. Stále platí, že byste si ji vzal na hrad jako poradkyni, nebo už jste to přehodnotil? Paní profesorka je expertkou na účetnictví, takže pokud jde o radu ohledně účetnictví, rád bych její expertízu využil. Professor Nerudova is an expert in accountancy. So as regards advice on accountancy or accounting, I would like to use her expertise, which is something very different. So I think the Nerudova team made a serious blunder here because it is a false claim which doesn't help at this stage of hot campaigning. Yeah, it's to your question. Yes, I completely agree. And when I was talking about political parties, I was talking about this election 2023, not the previous elections. And I would like to emphasize that both Václav Klaus and Miloš Zeman didn't win election because of their support, of their leadership of political parties, but because they were men of 1989. This is what Bára said about this strong, charismatic, male dominating figures. Yeah, and I completely agree with Bára on it. So it was a charisma that decided, not party membership that decided it. Yeah, that's probably it. I really liked the comment on Babiš being a Marmite figure, like Fico and Janša, and enjoying talk show politics, because I think his chances are much higher than any public pollsters are predicting right now. So what we will see in the coming 3 weeks will be a lot more of Babiš. And for me, it is beyond belief, beyond my understanding, beyond comprehension that Macron had him.
Yes, we can come back to that. I mean, it's not last time it was Orban, now it's Macron. So
absolutely, yeah. Orban in Teplice, Macron in Paris, or Riviera. I don't know.
Yeah, and we should say chat show. Andrej Babiš's last election rally was in the form of a chat show with a special red sofa in I don't quite know where it's called, a concert hall. Hey, Barbara, I think you wanted to pick this up.
I wanted to take it in a slightly different direction, but I think an important one that needs to be mentioned, which is that there's a sickness in Czech party politics, and that is the disintegration or the implosion of left-wing parties. And so I think we have to view anything that happens with the presidency in that light, in the sense that there is a huge part of the electorate which I think quite legitimately feels that they've been left behind, that their problems are not taken seriously, be it indebtedness, being lack of employment opportunities, huge divergence between quality of life between cities and regions. And so where am I going with this? That I think some of that is then playing in the presidential elections in the form of certain type of populism. I mean, it goes mostly to Babiš, but we've seen the rise of Basta in the past couple, who's the sort of extreme right candidate, but as it often is often the case, the National Socialist type of candidate who picks up the social topics.
And a former social democrat.
And a former social democrat.
And dissident.
And a dissident who's probably just lost it, as far as I can tell. Completely, but we have these apolitical candidates kind of picking up topics that are just not represented in party politics, and it just makes for this very skewed situation, which is very, very unhealthy. That's probably it. I wanted to raise that.
Okay, Tim.
So just a couple of things. I mean, just to pick up on Barbara's point, I mean, for those of you, who don't know, that the last parliamentary elections in the Czech Republic, both the Social Democrats and the Communists fell below the threshold. And actually, Babiš has been extremely effective at reorientating himself from what was originally a kind of new anti-corruption sort of centrist kind of appeal into very much mopping up those voters very effectively. The second thing to kind of just emphasize, just on Sean's question, I mean, there's discontent with the current crop of political parties, but I don't know if there is still quite a demand to see new parties emerge, I think. So I wonder if it's more a kind of belief, a hope that you could get rid of many of the current crop of parties and they could be replaced by new parties. I think that we may well see one or two of these presidential candidates could be at the forefront of new political parties post this presidential election. That is something with my Slovak politics hat on, I would say we've seen it a number of times in the Slovak case, and I think that we may well see that in the Czech case. So I don't know if it's completely anti all parties. It's just a discontent with the current crop.
Okay, and do you have an idea where the new party might come from, or is that just hard to say?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, look, I think that there are three reservoirs of support where a new party could come from. One is the kind of essentially where sort of Babiš has put quite a lot of his tanks on a particular law, which is a little bit more of economically interventionist, tied to a more kind of patriotic appeal. That I think would be one basis for a political party. Secondly, Nerudova's kind of idea of restarting. I mean, this sounds so familiar to those of us like Sean and myself who've studied new parties. There are many across the region that we might see that as a basis. And thirdly, potentially there could be something more traditional that might emerge to kind of replace particularly the Social Democrats. I mean, that party is in real difficulty at the moment, but there's a real potential for a strong Social Democratic Party in the Czech Republic, I would suggest. But those are, I mean, I'm probably mapping out the entire spectrum, aren't I, by saying those three areas, but I think those three packages could work for a new party.
Okay, well, let's sort of, I mean, you mentioned that the only real left-wing, traditional left candidate, Josef Štědrla, the trade union leader, dropped out. And slightly to my surprise, he endorsed Danuše Nerudová, who doesn't strike me as a figure on the traditional left. I think we really must talk about Danuše Nerudová, so I think we come back to her. And she's the real story, I think, of the campaign. And I just wanted to ask you, what does her rise really mean? Does it represent? And is she the real deal in terms of a sort of, we've mentioned Čaputová, is she this reformist change figure? Is she more of a symbol? Is she a product of clever marketing? How should we read the sort of Nerudova phenomenon? And maybe also how do you see her prospect? I mean, in the polls, she's a bit down. She's in third place. She was roughly tied. So how do we make sense of Nerudova and her rise from a rather distant third place to a very credible second and third?
I mean, I still think that in the next few days, there's a lot of fluidity in those polls. So I wouldn't be surprised if she ends up being one of the two candidates in the second round. What's also very interesting, actually, if you look at the recent STEM polls that came out, that if she were to get through, that her core is the smallest of the three, but her potential is the greatest of the three. So she may well stand an extremely good chance if she were to get through to the second round. Her challenge is really to mobilize a lot of that kind of core vote for her in the next few days. And that's why I think she is being kind of strongly kind of anti-Babiš and also trying to distinguish herself against Pavel. I think she has to do that. On your kind of broader question, I think she embodies that kind of sense of a desire to see something new, a desire to put behind the kind of the past. She is someone who is trying to appeal in that kind of broad, reformist, centrist kind of place. And she's been quite effective at doing that. I mean, that's why I think, potentially, if she wanted to, she could be the basis for a new political party post the election, I think. Whether she's the real deal or not, probably these two know more about things than me. I mean, I've got some comments, but I believe in experts, so I'll go with these two first, and maybe I can chip in afterwards.
I just had one comment about Středula's leaving, and it sort of follows a little bit on what we were saying earlier about left-wing politics. I have a question mark about whether his voters are actually really going to follow his advice to vote for Nerudova.
I think it's extremely, I mean, most considered opinion is it's unlikely, although it is also worth emphasizing that there are not that many votes.
That's true. No, that's fair.
Sorry.
But it leads into what I was going to say about Nerudova, which is that, I mean, if left-wing politics can be understood, I think, in two sort of broad areas. One is the socioeconomics and one is the sort of sociocultural stuff. I hate to call it identity politics, but it's that kind of progressivism, social progressivism. And I think she's definitely on the right-wing side in terms of socioeconomics, which means she's not going to be very attractive to the people on the left who don't have a good home. And so I do have a question about whether people who have been Czech Social Democratic Party voters will bring themselves, or green, even green voters, although she is quite green, she's a bit more greener than that, might bring themselves to vote for her, for example, in the second round. I hope they would. Her social progressivism, though, also, although that she's better on that, or she's more to the left on that, I find that she doesn't always have those instincts immediately, whether that's a cautiousness on her part or whether that's that she genuinely actually, on issues that I would consider, that kind of left-wing progressivism, whether she really just either doesn't know or does not have the instinct to, to give an example. For a long time, she said she's not a feminist. And I haven't seen this myself, but sort of secondhand heard that she is now actually said in an interview with Respect that she is, which we can again interpret as I don't think this is a strategic move in the Czech context, but maybe that she's kind of but a bit pragmatically, given her electorate, has decided to go there. An area where I think actually I give her more credit is, for example, question of transgender rights, where she was asked a couple of days ago what does she think about the obligatory mandatory sterilization of trans people, and she said she doesn't know, or she was not supportive, but having had people from the community come to her and explain it to her, she sort of changed her opinion. And sort of said, now that I know more, this is an actual real issue for a small minority, but it's a dramatic issue for this small minority. And I understand this is not a human rights compliant thing, and I would be against this. So what I'm trying to say is I think she is now understanding that that's her sort of space, that's her advantage. But going back to the question, is she the real deal? I often don't. Actually, I mean, I think she doesn't have the instinct on the socioeconomic stuff. And I have some questions about whether she has the right instinct, the human rights, if you want, on some other social issues, like the ones that I mentioned either.
Okay. Well, I guess I can push strategy.
Yeah. If I can chip in with skeptical voice. The problem of Danuše Nerudová is exactly the same like of Jiří Drahoš and old pattern of anti-politics in Czech history. Because I'm good at how did she frame her campaign. I'm like Čaputová, and of course she's not, because Čaputová had a record of hard local and national politics at least for 15 years. And I remember her as a very tough campaigner, very strong on the side of human rights and transparent politics. Danuše Nerudová has none of this. She is no Czech Čaputová. She profiled herself as, I'm a good manager and I'm an academic. The prestige of academics in Czech politics is unbelievable, only beaten by doctors. You can be Dr. Pirk and you will make it to the Senate. Yeah, this is nemocnice na kraji města, great style. So it's a typical anti-politics. And yeah, trust me, I'm a doctor, trust me, I'm prof. Yeah. And when the problems started appearing and question marks started appearing about whether everything was all right at Mendel University, and now we know that it is shockingly wrong, yeah, with the doctorate program. We talked about it, about her academic pedigree, which friends in Czechia told me, well, actually, she's not that different from the rest of academia, which is not very reassuring, but not a big problem, probably. But the problem is that, and this is where we differ, because I think we were talking about social media exchange with Bara, and I said that for me, to say that, yeah, maybe she's a bad manager, maybe she's a mediocre academic, but she's a woman, is a sexism. Yeah, it's almost like saying, well, but maybe she's a poor professional, but she's a pretty nice girl. Yeah, which to me sounds like an awfully derogatory reason why to vote for a candidate on the basis of identity politics. And Bara mentioned it, mentioned identity politics. I think we agree on many things. One thing on which we disagree is that I'm more radical as regards of identity politics. I agree with French critical school that says that identity politics has totalitarian elements. Yulia Kristeva is very strong on this because she says, if you vote or if you want somebody just because what they are, this is political romanticism. This is actually profoundly conservative and reactionary, even when it's labeled as progressive, in a style, co je české, to je hezké. You know, what is Czech is nice. You know? And I think we have to get over it. And I'm afraid that with Danuše Nerudová, we have the Corbyn effect. Oh, Jeremy Corbyn, well, lovely mobilization of identity politics and politics of values, which will be coming as a burden in the coming days and 2 weeks. So, and my worry is, don't get me wrong, my worry is that if Danuše Nerudová makes it to the second round and Andrej Babiš makes it to the second round, pollsters will be entirely wrong, because Andrej Babiš, with his "I'm an expert, trust me, she doesn't know anything," will be winning a lot of votes beyond Prague 3 district.
Thanks for that. Actually, also that pollsters are saying that there are some shy Babiš voters. I think we used to talk about shy Tories in this country, and there's been speculated that there are a few. I should say as well, the doctors as a whole, we won't go to the Czech Republic, actually had a doctors' party, Doktorzy CZ, who run in a regional election and were very successful. So there's a whole, dentists and doctors, there's a whole saga there. Can I just sort of push this point a little bit and kind of ask, really, we've got this issue about, are these candidates there as symbols, or do they really stand for something? I mean, I think, to put it another way, what is this election really about? I mean, I think we know the differences between Babiš and the other two, but I still wonder, what is the election about? Is it just about Andrej Babiš? Is it the same as the previous election when it was Zeman or not Zeman? And also with the two, with Nerudova and General Pavel. I've read in places, that she profiles as a liberal and as modern and as kind of a change candidate. He is the kind of continuity candidate. He's got this order and calm and order, and the lion is his symbol, and so on. But I'm just wondering, really, whether they really stand for anything, or whether they're really ciphers. Is there really a sort of liberal conservative split between the two? I went on their websites and read them thoroughly, and I couldn't really detect these ideological differences very much. So what's the election about? And is there a difference really between Pavel and Nerudova, really? You have any views about that?
I'm just going to say quickly one thing, and which is that the role of the president in the constitution is so minimal that it's actually, I think we kind of have to ask ourselves the questions, what can they actually really fight about legitimately, given the powers that they have constitutionally? The other question is, what will they represent as symbols? Are they going to be protecting democracy? Are they going to be trying to be consensual? Are they going to be, trying to unite people rather than divide, as Klaus and Zeman, frankly, have done? And so I I think that I don't think they're empty. I think they're empty in terms of, you know, a right-left wing political struggle as we normally understand it. But I ask the question whether that's actually what you should have play out when you're talking about the presidency specifically. So I almost feel that I may be a bit more positive than usually on this, that I think they're sort of saying things that need to be said at this point in the sort of, you know, in relation to the presidency in the Czech context. I'm going to respect the constitution. I'll take it seriously. I take democracy seriously. I think we have to be president of all people, you know, all these things which can sound really like shibboleths or something, but actually they're essential, you know, and very, very important. So I'll just say that.
Okay. Yeşil or Tim, do you want to?
Yeah.
I mean, one level, I think the election is primarily about Babiš. I think Czech politics is largely about Babiš. Now, that may sound incredibly simplistic, and at one level it is, but it also speaks to a fundamental truth of politics. Is there a difference between the two candidates? I think you're right in terms of, because that's what the election is primarily about, then it's a little bit about how the two candidates are kind of cloaking themselves in a way that can attract voters and hence defeat Babiš. They're basically playing to their strengths. I mean, Pavel is playing to his strength as a military man. Nerudova is playing to strengths. Let's put the scandals to one side as an economist and a manager. And those are appeals that go down well with Czechs at the moment. I mean, it's interesting just looking at Nerudova's website. I mean, she talks a lot about influence, and she's basically suggesting that presidents just have influence. I mean, she goes through the constitutional powers that a president has, but basically says it's all about influencing the debate, and that's what she seems to be projecting that she would bring if she were to be elected.
And of course, it's not true, because Czech president actually, even in the written constitution, can amass huge power. Yeah, if you read the Czech constitution, yes, it's a parliamentary regime. But if the president decides to play the role of not negative legislator, but negative destroyer of the constitutional regime, he or she can be very powerful. And we could see it in the last 10 years. So for me, this election is simply about keeping Babiš at gates. Outside gates. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's because what is coming up in the coming months will be appointments of 6 constitutional judges. And yes, constitutional court is, to me, the basic pillar of democratic constitutionalism of the Czech Republic. And we know that persons matter. Of course, Babiš, if he becomes president, has to negotiate with the Senate. Zeman couldn't, because Zeman enjoyed the structure. And I can tell you, I can easily imagine Babiš negotiating with segments of ODS and segments of Starostové to get people who will be a lot easier to handle at Constitutional Court in Brno than the current judges. This is one thing. Next thing, Czech president can influence the executive branch of the government. Although it's not written, or the text of the constitution is such that Czech president can really play day-to-day role in Czech politics. If the president attends meetings of the government, he has to be given a voice every time he asks or she asks for it. So there is a lot of space in Czech constitution, like in any constitution, which can be successfully exploited or for destructive or reconstructive effects. And let's not forget the Rusnok government moment, which was the moment when Czech Republic, if Social Democrats didn't use the emergency brake at the very last minute, we would end up in the semi-presidential republic, because this government could be pushed through parliament and the regime would change. Entire power game would change. So let's not underestimate the powers of president. About the symbols, I wrote a book about legal symbolism. There is a lot of symbolism, but symbols are part of politics, part of law, part of constitution. It's interesting how General Pavel plays this traditional conservative Czech politics. Řád a what is this other?
Klid.
Oh, klid. Yeah. If you say řád a klid to my generation, it sounds almost like, well, back to the 70s.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm sure that this is the campaign of the, really like, let's make sure that people in Česká Lípa can vote for me too.
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, he seems to be a less conservative figure. I've just got one. We'll open up the audience because I'm conscious that you've been sitting there with questions brewing. But so usually just one final thing. And so there really still is an issue around Czech democracy. I mean, the 2021 parliamentary elections, there was a big campaign to kind of prevent Babiš being a kind of a Czech Orban, and just to emphasize the point, he invited Orban along. This time it seems to have been a much kind of calmer, less polarized campaign, but there's still an issue then with the rule of law if we have a President Babiš or maybe if we have a President Pavel. I don't know what's your...
Like in any democracy, democracy is always an open risk project. We can see it here, and for me, a great explanation was when Babiš didn't know who wrote Good Soldier Švejk. When he invited Orban to Teplice, or to Ústí, and this was the most stupid thing that you can do, because no Czech will take advice from a Hungarian prime minister. Yeah, they may hate Roma, they may hate immigrants, they may hate everybody, but they won't be lectured by Orban. Yeah, so this was a big mistake, and plus he got all the extremist votes, but he lost his allies because communists didn't make it to parliament, social democrats didn't make it to parliament, so he ended up in opposition. Let's hope it will be a replay.
Okay, he seems to be playing a kind of more calm, clever game at the moment, but we'll see. And he's discovered the virtues of an independent judiciary, having been acquitted, which I noticed. Okay, Barbara, Tim, do you want to come in on that point before we? Okay,
I think we should.
We should. Okay, so we'll turn first of all to our audience who are here at UCL. If you have questions or comments, keep them reasonably succinct, and we'll take them in threes. Is that okay? And so I think we have. Well, at the front, would you like to?
Just a question for Mr. Przegaj. You mentioned that the communist past is something that we should get over, and that in fact now after 33 years of activity of these individuals, we should forget that and look more at what they have done during the 33 years. Is it correct to say then that any politician now in power with communist past is okay?
Okay, thanks for that. And we're just in the middle.
I wanted to ask a bit about the kind of international context. Do you see any of them bring any sort of change to alliances with Europe, or how the Czech Republic might conduct business, or is the presidency really too late to have anything to do with that?
Okay, thanks. Does someone want to? Okay, we'll take those two, I think. So communism and the role of foreign policy. I think Nerudova has been identified by one commentator as a kind of Zelensky-esque new idealist. I don't know what the label is, but maybe you'd like to.
Okay, I want to clarify here, certainly not forget, but to make it a central issue of the campaign. After 33 years, you have to take it into the context of dealing with the past, even the post-communist past. And because Nerudova said that she wouldn't appoint any former communist to sit on the constitutional court, to me, this is a cheap anti-communism, because then you would have to kick out the best constitutional judges in the last 30 years who actually drew on, who actually built the jurisprudence, the whole theory of democratic constitutional state. I mean, Pavel Hollander, I mean, Vladimír Klokočka, yeah, what they did, and they were former communists. So to say this, yeah, that anybody who was a former communist shouldn't sit on constitutional court, you have to be more qualified. And I certainly didn't say forget. I think we have to deal with the past.
To get over it.
To get over it,
Right.
yes. To get no. It's very different from forgetting. We have to inquire about the past, and I think it's absolutely legitimate to inquire about Babiš's past, about General Pavel's past, what was going on there in the 1980s, and how come that he could make it to high structures of NATO in 1990s. Was there a lustration by NATO, or was there? Yeah, that's absolutely legitimate, and that is what we definitely shouldn't forget about the past. But we have to factor in the past of post-communism, of what happened in the 1990s, what happened in the 1990s, what happened in the around 2000. So it's to me, for instance, a good example is Jaroslav Bašta. We didn't speak about him too much. Jerry Yummy, as I heard, yeah, that Jaroslav Bašta, who former dissident, certainly a courageous man, something which to me would be a matter of virtue if you stand up to the despotic, anti-democratic regime. But you have to ask other questions about Bašta. What is he doing now? And yeah, so for me, history is more complex than just communist member of the Communist Party wrong, and if you were not, then yeah, after all, many non-communists were simply cowards, as we know from Škvorecký.
So what you're saying is, if I may continue, you saying that the time of 33 years now prevails over the past, which is now going into the distance. Yeah,
that you have to, if you want to deal with the past, it's not simple dividing line 1989 before and 1989 after. Yeah, it's more complex. History is now more complex. Plus, if I were to be a realist, yeah, the fact that Andrej Babiš could become prime minister, even with his history of secret police agent, only demonstrates that Czech electorate is not interested in it.
And so if say Nerudova was elected, she's somebody who's too young to really have any of these issues in it. That wouldn't really matter them that much. I mean, I kind of look at Nerudova and I think, well, at least we'd get past all of this. You know, what did you do before 1989 stuff? This is
her great plus. Yeah, this is really a positive aspect of her campaign. Yeah, that's why she's so attractive for younger voters.
And not just the 80s, but the 1990s as well. And I really agree with you that this is about 1990s very much as well. And she doesn't have either of those pasts.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it would be a generational change, not just a gender change. Tim, do you want to? Sorry, Tim. You want to?
No, I mean, I would concur. I mean, I would just still say that for a certain generations, it still does matter, but that's an increasingly shrinking part of society for obvious demographic reasons. I mean, just picking up on the second question.
Indeed, yeah, if we could move.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably not. I mean, given the context of international politics at the moment, with war in Ukraine, the challenges that we're facing in Europe with energy and the like, I don't think there will be much of a difference depending on who wins in those kinds of senses. So I don't really expect to see much of a difference. Of course, the impact that a president can have is, of course, that individual, whoever he or she is the representative of that country. So the way that they act when they go abroad may also have an impact. And obviously the particular alliances they have. We've mentioned about Babiš and his links with someone like Macron, for example. That could be interesting to see, you know, actually having good relations, by the way, with the French president's not a bad thing within the EU. It's quite useful. So that could be quite helpful for the Czech Republic. But I don't really see much of a significant difference given the context of politics at the moment.
Do you think, say, Nerudova, she was elected, that would be a big story? It would get a lot of international coverage. It would be it would symbolically change the alter the image of the Czech Republic with that.
I think so, and I suspect that there would be some. I mean, if we go back to the Čaputová example, let's put aside how similar they are. I remember vividly, kind of, front page of the Financial Times in the day after the Slovak elections, Čaputová, just the face of a woman president. I mean, that says something just symbolically. So I think there would be good copy for the Czech Republic for that weekend at least.
And so General Pavel, I mean, someone said to me, well, this is a bit Latin American. They're going to elect a general as president. Would that send a different signal? I mean, we know.
It's a good question.
I haven't thought about it.
That's you spoke about symbols, and of course, I got my blue book, the certificate of being unfit for conscript communist army on 21st November 1989. So you can tell how dear it is to me. But and exactly, I was thinking initially, this is a bit rich. Czechs will never accept a military figure as the potential president. And this is what I said 3.5 years ago. And now I'm surprised how, of course, the situation is completely different. So a little bit of army might not be necessarily bad, even for Czechs. And the way it is played, for this is a question for Tim, and for political symbols is yes, and this is back to the question, because it's interesting how actually the campaign of General Pavel is playing on symbols of the past. And the rhetoric is really the rhetoric which is also the rhetoric of the 1980s. Řád, klid na práci, so that's
Okay, I should say if General Pavel is watching, we don't in any way suspect you of being kind of Latin American style populist, moderate and centrist figure. I'd like to pick up a question from Twitter, from Alan, and thank you for the not Twitter, Zoom. Thank you for the question, which is that we've talked about the kind of big three candidates. We've touched upon Jaroslav Bašta, the far-right SPD candidate. We've mentioned Josef Středula. We've barely mentioned the other candidates at all. Can we? I mean, we've got Pavel Fischer, we've got Hilscher, we've got others. I think we were talking about Zima, who's another political rector of Charles University. Is there anything that we need to add about the other candidates? Have they added anything to the contest? Do they matter in any way politically?
I think I don't want to speak too much, but what Bara said, that the collapse of left-wing politics, of social democracy, it's interesting how it's because left-wing voters in post-communist countries are socially more conservative. That's one of the differences between East and West still. And populists successfully exploited what Masaryk called the social question. The social question is being done in Hungary and Poland by Kaczynski and Orbán. They do redistribution. They care for those who feel like they lost out in 1989. This is not for presidential election, but and one of the most real things is that the leader of the trade unions endorses a neoliberal right-wing candidate. She admitted that she never voted. She always voted on the right. This is bizarre, but it's for the future and related to the question is those candidates who touched on the social question might form or might be behind new political parties. So for me, Josef Středula did a very clever thing. And obviously, he's thinking strategically for the future.
Okay, so he's kind of rehabilitated himself with this sort of rather clever statesman-like move, rather than just staying into the bitter end and being an also run as the other candidates.
And Pavel Fischer, obviously, what he did in the Senate was amazing. Yeah, his work in the Senate, tackling the problems of security, national security, the way he challenged Miloš Zeman on the Chinese-Russian politics, is going to the international relations is truly amazing. But he's a minor figure in this context, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Okay.
Just a small remark. Nerudova actually said he would support Nerudova mostly because he couldn't bring himself to vote for the two other candidates who had come in as part.
I have a candidate. We had just a little follow up from Zoom, which is someone's asking. It is Nicholas. Thank you. Given the lack of powers of the president, to what extent do you think that voters are actually assessing them on their social and economic views? The president has no real or limited influence on social and economic policy, but they're all talk, well, not all, but certainly Babiš is talking about it, and it's part of their conversation. So just if we come back to you, live audience here, do you have any thoughts about that? Are voters kind of picking up these social and economic messages, or is it?
I mean, I kind of said this before in that I think they have limited places to channel this in the parliamentary elections and in the rest of the political contestation. And so I think it's understandable that this comes up. And going perhaps a bit back to the previous question, what I found interesting, and I think almost every other candidate, with the exception of Babiš, who I think we might safely leave aside, basically mentioned social topics. And Pavel and Nerudova were striking in how I felt, how little they spoke about debt collecting, indebtedness, exclusion, marginalization. Almost every other candidate on stage, including Zima, including Hilscher, neither of whom I would consider necessarily as left-wing candidates. And I'm talking about the Sunday super debata. They all mentioned this as a sort of a sickness of Czech society, etc. So I find that to be quite interesting. You're right that the president might not be able to do that much about it, but the informal powers of the president, which is talking about things, raising topics, taking certain things seriously, is not inconsiderable. So I think it's not irrelevant what the president thinks about these things, what they think about human rights and what they think about marginalized, socioeconomically marginalized groups in society.
I don't want to overdo this point, but one thing that just is quite striking about those other candidates. I mean, two of those other candidates are senators, right? And what's interesting is the kind of anti-political, newness political appeal is important for explaining the success of Nerudova and of Pavel, and may help explain why two people who've been in politics for a lot longer have not been that successful. I don't want to overdo that point, but I think there's something to it. Just, on Středola, for example, I mean, what else was he? I mean, who else could he have endorsed? I mean, yes, the Babiš is. I mean, to go back to your point, Jiří, actually, if we think about the comparisons with Poland and Hungary, actually, in terms of redistributive politics, in terms of social support, Babiš's government did quite a bit of that in the same way, and so that's no surprise in a way that those kind of significant slice of those voters have been supporting Babiš. So for a politician like Středola, it's really important for Babiš to go, because that's where the core voters would be for someone like him.
Okay. Peter.
Thank you. I want to come back to that exchange that you and Jiří had about the sort of question of party support or party background for the president. You said, well, Klaus and Zeman both were party leaders and prime ministers, and you said that you didn't see that as the decisive factor in their being elected, but rather this kind of immediate post-89 charisma, strongman politics. And I sort of listened to both of those, and I kind of agreed with both of you. And I wonder if that's really the decisive question. In some sense, both of them were prime minister, right, for long years. And the fact is, okay, Havel, that's a particular case because that was right after 89. But there has not been a president who was not prime minister before for long years, who was not a dominant figure in the political scene. And I wonder to what degree, there has been this kind of, to me, it feels like an almost kind of rot or a kind of lack of political imagination. And it extends from when the president was elected by the parliament to when he has been elected by general election. It's like the person who we've been talking about in the pubs for years and years must be sort of the person who then moves up. It's almost as if, the qualification to be president is to have been prime minister. And, maybe this election will be the kind of acid test for whether that continues or not. But I wonder if there's not a way to think about this as a test of whether somebody can come into the presidency without that kind of standard background of simply having been prime minister and thereby having dominated headlines for so long. Is it possible to come in from outside, as it were?
Okay. I'm also conscious we've got the Q&A version of a manel. So if there are any female audience members who'd like to ask a question, please raise a hand, or students for that matter, and or. Okay.
Two gentlemen.
Okay, I'm. Okay, yeah, okay. I'm.
Beautiful ladies here. But if I might give the panel opportunity to speculate a little bit. If the court decision would have been known 6 months ago, do you believe that Babiš would be running to be president, which is the first part of my question. And the second speculative one, if we're going to look a little bit further ahead for the parliamentary elections, and Babiš, if he would end up the Prague Castle as the president, what do you believe would that mean for our movement? It has been said here by Jiří that the movement is by a large degree based on one-man show. So do you think that the movement, the political party, basically shooting itself in the foot, so to speak? And I don't recall in the past that we would have a president from the party who would be the prime minister as well of the running government.
Okay, and I can do. Is that you, Alan, behind the camera?
Yes.
You think it is?
Yes.
Sorry, I can't see you. If you could do super speedily, because we're a bit.
Yes. I want to return to the title of the round table. So it was going to the castle, obviously. There were suggestions that we don't know what will happen in the second round, but if the campaign has been so much about Andrej Babiš, isn't it very likely that after all, the second round will also be about Babiš? And so the anti-Babiš side will mobilize behind, anyone who's going to make it there. The voters will be voting for the alternative, holding the nose if necessary. And also, I'm not quite sure I buy that, at least looking at the data from previous elections, I buy the shy Babiš voters argument very much, because in the last election, Arno's support was, if anything, actually overestimated in the polls, because these days you don't have face-to-face polls, it's all online, and the shy voters, if they were ever existing, no longer exist.
Okay, so we have 3 questions. One is to do with charisma parties, Babiš's trial, and Babiš-centered second round and campaign. So who would like to pick them up?
I'll just quickly react to the last question, which is to say that one thing that I felt better about this election than I felt about the past ones. And I think it's because I feel like the rest of the field has been behaving sort of nicely to each other. They've been behaving as if they really know that ultimately they're going to have to endorse each other. And I mean, the attacks have been mild. As we said, I mean, the fact that Nerudova, the worst thing she can say about Pavel is, he used to be communist, is actually, again, that's kind of nice, And I mean, quite aside from the fact whether they're interchangeable in terms of their actual opinions and sort of, you know, what they've been campaigning on. So that gives me optimism as somebody who's hoping for an anti-Babiš result, that everybody's in kind of conscious that this is about Babiš, as we've said, and that they have to prepare for the second round, actually, rather than the first round. That has been my impression. But it's more sort of, I'm not a political scientist, I haven't been studying this, but just as somebody who's been watching it. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful it's going to be whoever's going to be standing against Babiš, but I know Jiří's more skeptical. And I think Nerudova's chances are not as bad as Jiří's thinks, I think.
I think Andrej Babiš's chances are higher than we think.
Okay.
Yeah. And exactly for what Peter said, that from prime minister to president, yeah, and Andrej Babiš was prime minister, and he will use this card of competence. And of course, it will all be about symbolism. Yeah, that it will be empty, and that's why I think he's stronger than polls show, and yeah, that so. But I believe that you can jump the queue. Yeah, it's not a rule, it's a pattern, and the pattern doesn't have to be repeated. So I think that both Petr Pavel and Danuše Nerudová have good chances. If they go into the second round, I think that I must say I was impressed by Pavel during the debate. Yeah, there were some completely crazy moments, like Karel Čiviš. Yeah, he really looked like he really looked like he was high on something. Yeah, but Bašta not responding to the questions. And this minimalism of Pavel, who said, yeah, where everybody else said 3 sentences, he said just 1. Yeah, I think it has a certain appeal, which is in complete contrast. And now we talk about pure symbols and styles. Babiš sooner or later always gets agitated and angry and yeah, unsettled. Pavel is very strong in the debate as a calming element. So this is about the style. And so in the second round, that my bet would be on Pavel being more able to beat Babiš because of conservative symbols, because what Czechs like, those checkered jackets and checkered shirts and stuff like this. But what Przemysl asked, speculate. And yes, I don't believe that the judgment will have a big effect because it's actually anti-Babiš. Yeah. So you were shouting for the last couple of years, all justice is politicized. This is a political cartel against me. And now he was found not guilty. So what were you shouting about? It's another strong argument that can be used against him. You're rocking the system when actually the system works well, the system of justice, I mean. This is and the second question was about parliamentary elections. This is a terrific question because if Babiš becomes president, who's going to lead ANO into the next parliamentary election? And that's obviously he has a lot of Santa's little helpers, but I think to me, the real risk is that the center of executive power will be completely moved to the castle. So the prospect of Babiš winning the election and making a deal about constitutional judges with conservative parties in the Senate and ANO winning the next parliamentary election, well, not a good prospect.
Okay, Tim,
yeah, can I respond to those? So on to Peter's interesting question, and my response to that, I'm conscious that maybe this is my Slovak focused way of looking at it. Is it possible for someone who hasn't been a kind of prime minister to become a president? Well, if they're an odborník of some description, if they have some kind of real expertise, I think that possibly could work. And I think that's part of what the appeal of Pavel and Nerudova are. And that's where the danger lies for Nerudova, if she's challenged to basically point out that her expertise is pretty thin. So I think it could be possible to do that, but you have to demonstrate you have some real expertise from outside politics that would be useful if you're in the castle. On the question about the court decision, I don't think it would have made much difference if it was a year ago, let alone 6 months ago. I think in terms of what I'm interested in, which is voting habits and how Czechs perceive it, Czechs have made up their mind about Andrej Babiš quite a long time ago. And this court decision makes very little difference, I think, in terms of their voting
Can I
perspective.
just really quickly interject? I understood your question differently, namely, would have Andrej Babiš wanted to actually even run for the castle if he did not need immunity from that position? And I think it's an excellent question. I don't have an answer, but no, because I thought that was a great question.
A lot of speculation.
Yeah,
Was immunity.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I didn't realize that was the angle you're pushing.
Who knows? It's a great question.
But what I would say is, let me push the boat out here, and maybe I'm wrong, but I actually don't know if Babiš wants to win this presidential election, but he wants to win the next parliamentary election. And the important thing about running in this presidential election, him running, not anybody else from ANO running, there were one or two other people who could have run. There is a little bit more to ANO than just one person. I think Babiš really wants to cement his position as the real opponent of the Fiala government, and to cement his position so that he's then in the position for the next parliamentary elections that he will challenge the Fiala government, which likely will lose support, and Babiš will return not to the castle, but to the prime ministerial office. I think that may be the game. I could be completely wrong, but that's the sense I get. In terms of Alan's question, I mean, how far should we believe the polls? I don't know. I've been chatting with a number of pollsters. I think personally that if Babiš, that whoever gets into the second round against Babiš will defeat Babiš, because there is a strong enough anti-Babiš vote to do it, and whoever that is, I think is most likely to do it, unless, and this is always the fascinating thing in politics, unless a candidate absolutely implodes. And there is a possibility always that in a second round with two candidates, that one candidate could implode, and perhaps it's more likely that Nerudova would implode than Pavel, but that's speculation. I don't know.
Okay, well, time has unfortunately caught up with us, so we're going to have to wind up. I was going to ask you all who you thought would win. I surmise you expect Petr Pavel to emerge on top, or Babiš. I'm not sure. Who's going to win?
I'm not a political scientist, but I will tell you, yes, I want Petr Pavel to make it for the second round against Babiš, because I believe he has stronger chances of beating Babiš. And this is for me the first and main and only question of the election. Yeah, let's keep Babiš away from presidential powers, because he can be very dangerous.
Okay, Tim, you expect we're not going to have President Babiš?
Yes, I don't think it'll be President Babiš. I think it'll be one of the other two, and I'm not really sure. My instinct at the moment is to expect Pavel, but I really think that there is a lot of, it's worth emphasizing, we talked a bit about polls, so 25% or so of Czechs suggest that they're undecided. There's quite a lot of potential movement that can happen in the next few days. So who knows, it could be, you know, what could be a fascinating runoff would be Nerudova against Pavel, which is not completely impossible that would happen. I think it's only about 10% likelihood, but not completely impossible.
Okay. And Barbara, I'm going to give you.
I'm going to leave it with Tim, because he knows much more about this.
No, but your insights would be great.
President Nerudova, that's a distant prospect, or?
I think it's a more distant prospect than Pavel. If there's a, I think Pavel is more likely to make it to the second round, I think, and I just hope that then it's not going to be Babiš.
Okay. Well, we'll.
What about you, Sean?
I don't know. I think we're going to have a surprise. It wouldn't. I think there will be some kind of a surprise. I think that's unlikely a scenario. It could just happen. And I think you say, Danuše Nerudová, she's good in debates. She's a little bit less wooden than Pavel. So I wouldn't rule her out maybe quite as much. I share your sort of reservations about her kind of concept, her whether she's got real clear kind of content, but I wouldn't rule her out. So I suppose I'd put my money on her if I was going to gamble, but we'll soon find out. So we'll find out part of the story on Saturday lunchtime, and then in 2 weeks' time we will know who's won the race to the castle. And at that point, I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring things to a close. Can I thank all our panelists for a really fascinating and engaged discussion, which I think has gone well beyond the simple facts of it. Beyond the roots of Czech politics. I thank our audience. I thank our audience on Zoom as well. And those of you who are here, physically here, we do have some wine and beer and soft drinks. So if you'd like to join us for a drink to continue discussion a little more informally, we'd be delighted to talk to you. Okay, thanks very much.